Well, welcome everyone. I think we should make a start. My name is Alan Packwood, and I'm the director of the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College in Cambridge. The Archive Centre is one of the largest repositories in the United Kingdom for modern personal papers. And this event is one in a series of occasional presentations about the people whose archives we hold. Tonight, we're recalling and celebrating the remarkable and varied life and legacy of Professor Davidson Nicol. We collect the papers here of politicians, of diplomats, and of scientists. And of course, he was all of those things and so much more, as we're going to hear. We want you, our audience, to participate by sharing your memories and by asking questions of our panel. And to do that, we'd ask you to use the Zoom Q&A function. You can start doing that straight away, but we're going to come to your questions and comments at the end after our presentations. Now, when talking about a figure like Davidson Nicol, we realized that we needed an experienced chair with an understanding of the many fields of activity in which he was engaged. And I'm delighted that we have Lord Boateng, Paul Boateng, a long-standing Labour politician, the first Black British cabinet minister, a former High Commissioner to South Africa, and I could go on and on. So a former politician and a former diplomat like Davidson Nicol, who shares his passion for education and who has just become the chair of our Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust and a member of our Archives Committee. So Paul, without further ado, thank you and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. We're really thrilled to be hosting this event, and I am delighted that the Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust is housed at the same centre where we are holding the papers of this remarkable man, Professor Davidson Nicol. His importance is self-evident in the sense that he was of a generation who brought Africa, his own country, Sierra Leone, to independence, who represented Sierra Leone and the very best of Africa in his life as a physician and scientist, in his life as a diplomat and educator. A many-faceted life for a truly African Renaissance man, because he was in at the rebirth of a continent and the formulation of his nation, Sierra Leone. I'm particularly thrilled to be hosting this event, which involves his family members, his close associates, people whose lives have been touched and influenced by Davidson Nicol. I am particularly glad to be doing that because of my own family's connection with Davidson Nicol. My father was a cabinet minister in Ghana in the 60s, and in that role was chair of the University Council in Legon, the premier university of Ghana, when he was Minister of Education, and would have been present when Davidson Nicol delivered his seminal lecture at the university in 1964, Africa, a Subjective View. And Professor Nicol said in the course of that lecture, indeed concluded with this phrase: Africa now belongs to us again, and we should see to it that we are always worthy of it. Very, very important words. They are a challenge and an inspiration. The continent, our beloved continent of Africa hasn't always lived up to that challenge. At its best, it has. And it is by remembering and honoring men like Davidson Nicol that we challenge ourselves in the continent to do better still. We're now going to hear something of his life and work, but in hearing his life and work, I just want all of you who are participating to know that there will be an opportunity as we come to the conclusion of today's event for you all to contribute with questions to our distinguished panel of participants and remarks as to what Davidson Nicol has meant to you. This very special man who we remember today. And who better to begin that process of recollection and memory than one of Professor Nicol's 5 children. We hope to be joined by another in the course of this webinar, but we begin with Charles Nicol, who is someone who in many ways has followed, as we all have, in our father's footsteps. Charles read natural sciences at Christ, has made a career in information technology, was a distinguished and indeed pioneering, if I may say so, Charles, broadcaster on the BBC, when there weren't that many black voices, I can tell you, in the UK before going over to the United States and playing a very important role in establishing the UN's broadcasting profile. So, Charles, let's begin. We never escape in Africa, do we, our fathers and mothers? Whatever we achieve in life, we're always introduced when we're on the continent as our parent's child. It's a bit galling when you've done something in your own life, as you have, and indeed as I have. But there you are. But your father was worthy of that distinction. So tell us what it was like growing up to be the son of such a man.
Well, thank you very much. It was an interesting experience. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Churchill Archives and Alan Packwood, the director, and you, Lord Worthing. This is a wonderful event for the family, and we're very privileged to be able to take part in it. Thank you. How does one begin? I mean, you say, well, I followed in my father's footsteps. Well, I did. I went up to Christ. I'm sure it would take a very subtle professor to find similarities after that, but here we go. I would, a part of his history that has not really been told too often is how he got there. He attended the Prince of Wales School in Freetown and left in 1941. The Prince of Wales School was the preeminent boys' secondary school at that time. It was a new school. It had only been open for about 15 years at that time. And he left the sixth form and went to teach there for a year in science. But he also got a job at the government census office. Now you have to understand that Freetown was a huge natural port in the war. It was, I guess, the largest convoy gathering point in Africa for convoys that were coming up to England during the war years. And so there was a very active intelligence censorship function going on there. So he got a job there. I think he acquitted himself quite well, although he never actually let on to me the secrets he uncovered. But while there, he met Graham Greene, who was, working in Freetown at the time, whose manager at the time actually was Kim Philby. I don't know whether Father ever met him or he came out to Freetown. But that friendship with Graham Greene lasted for many, many years. I can remember spending Christmases with Graham Greene when he visited Freetown in subsequent years when my father was at Fourah Bay. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Dad jumped on a convoy, got a colonial scholarship to Cambridge, jumped on a convoy in 1942, and with not much untoward enemy action, which he was afraid of, arrived in England. At that time, the epitome, the culmination, and the hope of every colonial educated man there was usually to join the RAF, at least from West Africa. And unfortunately, my father could not because of his eyes. Many felt called, but few were chosen because of their eyes. Several of his colleagues from Sierra Leone managed to get into the Royal Air Force and Bomber Command, etc. But his plan B was Cambridge. And so he went up there, and fortunately for all of us, I think, avoided the war that way. He studied in Cambridge and in London University. The university hospital there was a source of a lot of postdoctoral research from him. And then he was invited to Nigeria, where I was born. He was invited to take part in the first faculty of the Ibadan Medical College, which was just starting out there. He was actually the model for the Jesus Christ statue in the university chapel. Huge crucifix, which I may still be there.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yes, he told me later on, later years, that he thought that helped with his credibility when he was giving his lectures. He had a good time in Ibadan, came back to Cambridge, where another brother of mine was born, and started the main research, which I believe Tendai is going to outline for us. But that is really how he got there. Dad was a Pan-Africanist. He was very influenced. And in those days, there were many Africans at college in the US and in England. Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kwame Nkrumah himself. There was DK from Nigeria in England, Kwapong from Ghana in England, and my father, of course. So it was an extraordinary mix of people there. He was very taken by the philosophies of Kwame Nkrumah, as Lord Boateng has outlined. He sent me to school in Ghana, mainly because of that, to Achimota College, which was an interesting experience. It is a very good school, but very married to the local and cultural Ghanaian environment. And so English was not the primary importance except in the classroom. So I had to very fast learn a few Ghanaian languages, which I hold to this day to my credit. But Dad was at that time, in fact, the director of the West African Exams Council. And so as you can imagine then with schoolboys, they said, oh, you don't need to worry. Your father signs the certificates anyway for the O-levels and A-levels. You're all set. But I feel that possibly with question time, we'll explore a little further, but that basically sets the scene for a career in Cambridge, which by all accounts was extraordinary.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that evocation of your dad and his times. Of course, your father's influence has transcended the generations, and we're very lucky to have joining us from Mexico. I mean, this is the most incredible webinar. We're all over the world. Joining us from Mexico, Tendai Chisoa, who really is of a new and upcoming generation, multi-faceted in her academic life and indeed in her interests encompassing biosciences, impact investing, entrepreneurship. You are pursuing at this time a neuroscience doctorate at Cambridge, and you've been very much involved with genomic editing and protein engineering to help us design new tools to deal with that increasingly prevalent concern around obesity. So share with us, Tendai, how Davidson Nicol has influenced you.
Yes, I'll be happy to. So let me just share my screen because I have a few visuals to make the science a little bit easier to understand. So you can all see my screen?
We can, and we can see an apple.
Okay, perfect. So as you mentioned, Davidson Nicol's research was very important, and it still has great impact today in developing treatments for diseases like diabetes. So Davidson Nicol was the first person to analyze the breakdown of insulin in the human body. So how does insulin work? When we eat food, it travels to our stomach. Here, travels to our stomach. And there it is broken down and some of it is converted to glucose, which is a sugar and energy source for the human body. So meanwhile, another organ called the pancreas, which you see here in yellow, releases insulin. So glucose and insulin pass into the bloodstream, but in order for the cells and muscles to work, they need the fuel from glucose. So insulin is important because it helps the glucose to pass from the bloodstream into the body cells to be used for energy. So by analyzing the breakdown of insulin, Davidson Nicol enabled future scientists to understand the mechanisms of disease with insulin dysfunction. For example, diabetes, which is quite prevalent globally, especially in people with obesity. So his scientific work and subsequent accomplishments continue to inspire my interdisciplinary pursuits as well, as I work to build a venture studio which will enable Black scientific entrepreneurs to build new biotechnology companies that develop therapeutics for diseases that burden Black communities. And this is important because many current drugs on the market are less effective in Black patients, and innovation is much needed to ensure treatment is equitable in Black patients. So Davidson Nicol still continues to inspire me and many other Black scientists globally. Thank you.
Well, Tendai, thank you for that. Thank you, if I may say so, also for the illustration. I think, understanding science is an issue for us non-scientists, and it helps. The visuals help.
Yes.
Tell us, if you would, Tendai. I mean, you're young. You are at Cambridge. Your parents were from Zimbabwe.
So I was born in Zambia.
You were born in Zambia.
Then, yes, moved to the US when I was quite young.
Tell us, I mean, how did you become aware of Davidson Nicol and the sort of the Cambridge Africa link?
Yeah, so I became aware of Davidson Nicol maybe 3 years ago, just because I work within metabolic sciences, and I was looking for more researchers who were of African ancestry, who contributed to diabetes and diabetes research. And so that's when I came across Davidson Nicol. And of course, then I was able just to see his illustrious career, and it was very inspiring to me.
Thank you. If I may say so, I think you're inspiring too, and you'll inspire a whole new generation of my grandchildren's age. And, that's very, very, that's good news. Very good news for Africa and for science.
Yes.
I wonder if now we can, I mean, we're beginning to get a sense of just how this man has impacted across the generations. We're lucky to have contributions this evening from people of his own generation who worked with him at the UN, worked with him as a diplomat. We're going to begin with a pre-recorded piece from Professor David Reynolds, who knew him as a young fellow at Christ when David was a young fellow at Christ in the 80s and worked alongside Nicol. And this is part of his academic experience before he went on as his country's permanent representative to the UN. So let's have Professor Reynolds' contribution up on the screen.
I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but it's a great pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about Davidson Nicol as a Fellow of Christ's College, as I remembered him in the 1980s and early 90s. Davidson graduated with first-class honors from Christ's in 1946. He was later made an honorary fellow of the college after his work in medicine, in university administration, and at the UN. According to the college website, he was the first Black African to graduate with first-class honors from Cambridge, and also the first Black African to be made a fellow of a Cambridge college. My contacts with him were relatively brief. I joined the college in the 1980s, and it was, of course, a time of enormous flux in international relations. At this stage, we were running in the history faculty, we were taking primary responsibility for the MPhil in international relations, which has now become a freestanding and very thriving operation within the Department of Politics and International Studies. But in those days, it was mostly run from the history faculty. It was largely a course which was just involved with dissertation without very much coursework. And so finding supervisors was a very important part of the whole project. Davidson and I talked about the course, about some of the supervisors. He was involved himself. We also spent a lot of time talking at lunch about the really remarkable changes in the world in the 1980s, the erosion of the Cold War, the era of Mikhail Gorbachev, the radical changes also going on in China. So this was a very exciting time, and I found him very interesting. I know one or two of my colleagues thought that Davidson was a little bit of a name dropper. He would come into lunch and he would say, I was talking to Mikhail Gorbachev last week. But I began to realize that actually he had talked to Mikhail Gorbachev last week. Indeed, he talked to all sorts of really interesting and important people. And I found that really quite interesting to share and listen to his thoughts about world leaders from this rather unique vantage point he had through the United Nations. Davidson was a man of great charm, a great conversationalist, a very perceptive person whose rather bonhomie manner concealed a very shrewd judgment about people and events. And he was somebody I remember with great affection from his time in college. Let me give you one example of his flair for particular situations and his remarkable contacts. I remember he said to me on one occasion, it was towards the end of the academic year, that the obvious person for, as an examiner, one of the examiners for a student of his, a graduate student of his, who was writing a dissertation about a particular international agreement that had been negotiated in the 1970s, I think, was a man who was now in London as the ambassador of one of the G7 countries, so a figure of considerable distinction in diplomacy. And Davidson said that he was planning to get this man as the external examiner. That was duly arranged. And then a little while later, he said to me, David, he said, I think we really should have a lunch for him in the college because he's of some significance. So I agreed with him, and we talked to the master, who was very obliging about this. And in the end, a lunch was arranged in the master's lodge for this ambassador. It was a very congenial occasion, but we were on strict instructions that this had to finish at 2 p.m. because the ambassador had a very important engagement back in London in the middle of the afternoon, and his driver was waiting in the car park with the limousine ready to take him back to London. So we had our lunch. We had very interesting conversation. Promptly at 2, the lunch came to an end. We got up and said our farewells. About 3:30, I think. It was a lovely summer afternoon. I had my window open. I suddenly heard this inimitable voice booming out in the court below. It was Davidson, and he was taking round the distinguished ambassador. Not in a rush, they were clearly deep in conversation and having a very pleasant time, enjoying the pleasures of the college and so on. And I realized that the urgent appointment in London had clearly evaporated under the finesse and charm of Davidson's conversation. So that's one of my memories of him, an impressive man, a congenial companion, someone who it was a pleasure to have known. Thank you very much.
That was a very precious insight into Davidson Nicol in the senior common room, as it were, and obviously very, very much at home there, just as he was very much at home in the corridors of international power in the United Nations. And we're very privileged to have joining us from Connecticut, Dr. Davidson Nicol, who was Assistant Director of Research and later Special Assistant to Davidson Nicol at the UN Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. And so he was able to observe him at first hand operating on the world stage as an Undersecretary General at the UN. We're really privileged to have you with us on this webinar, Dr. Andy Nicol. So just give us a sense of the man at the UN.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important event. There's nothing better I would like to do than pay tribute to Dr. Nicol. He was like a father to me. He took me under his wings, and I worked for 10 years under his supervision. He even took me to West Africa to introduce me to Sierra Leone and Senegal, and to promote a book that I wrote. Anyway, my focus is on the latter part of Dr. Nicol's career. This is from the diplomatic part, from 1968 until 1982. I got to know him as a young African official who ended up working for him for 10 years. First, as you said, as a researcher, and later on as his special assistant. And this lasted 10 years. And this was at the UN Institute for Training and Research. I'm really very grateful, one of those grateful Africans who consider him as their mentor. Let me now focus on 5 points. First, Dr. Nicol as a distinguished UN diplomat. When Dr. Nicol was posted in New York as ambassador of Sierra Leone and as permanent representative to the UN, he was one of the Pan-Africanist pioneers in New York. A batch of high-profile ambassadors were chairing important committees at the UN. And he helped navigate the last phase of colonialism in Africa. He was chairman of the legendary UN Committee of 24 on decolonization. This was in 1970 to 72. At that time, the committee handled the problem of liberating the Portuguese territories. He also served as Sierra Leone's ambassador to the Security Council. This was from 1969 to 1970, 2 years. Notably, he was president of the council in September 1970, when the Arab-Israeli problem flared up once again. Now, his leadership in the council was to resolve, during that time, to resolve the issue of hostages held by PLO representatives. And they hijacked an airplane and they were holding them. So Dr. Nicol had to negotiate with within the council to persuade them to take vigorous action. That was effective. This was in September 1970. And there was another crisis at that time, again in the Middle East, and that was when Israeli troops occupied Lebanon. So to persuade Israel to withdraw its troops was a very, very difficult issue. He handled that also as president of the Security Council. In the process, he became a lifetime friend of the future President Bush, who was ambassador of the United States in New York. And there were also other luminaries in the Security Council, including Malik of the Soviet Union, and a famous British ambassador, the former Hugh, the famous, Lord Caradon. Yeah. Lord Caradon was also there. So they were very, very close friends. This was during that crucial period. Now, after that, Dr. Nicol was recalled to Sierra Leone, and he was sent to London as the High Commissioner. But he didn't last long in London because the demand from the UN, from Secretary General Waldheim, was so strong, irresistible actually. He had to come back then to head the UN Institute for Training and Research with the rank of Undersecretary General. So he was executive director of UNITAR. Now at UNITAR, he succeeded Chief S.O. Adebo, another really legendary ambassador. Adebo had to return to Nigeria because Nigeria was having a very difficult time with conflict, and he really wanted to go back. So Dr. Nicol was the choice, and he was just the right choice. When he came, he was very innovative. all his past experience, research, dealing with academic work, publishing, all came into play. He was a visionary, actually, at UNITA, the UN Institute for Training and Research. Now, at UNITA, some of the innovations were in the field of peaceful settlement of disputes, development issues, and social issues, including the issue of women, equality of women and children. He was particularly interested in these social issues. But also he was a visionary at that time. At that time, he introduced at UNITA what we called as the Futures Project. There was the Club of Rome, was very active then, and therefore Dr. Nicol devoted resources to study the limitation of resources in the future, the depletion of oil resources, for example. What do you do for the future? So this was a very important project, and it was new. Now, and then, almost surprisingly, he also covered the issue of the future of the environment, climate change. UNITAR was doing a project, actually projects, on the futures at that time, thanks to Dr. Davidson Nicol. Now, when his time ended after 10 years, he retired from UNITAR. But I think Dr. Nicol, in his last years at UNITAR, last year actually, he did a seminal study, on the Security Council, the presidency in the Security Council. Now, this linked actually, it was a swan song, you might say, as a book. It linked his diplomatic experience and his research experience. Mm-hmm. In other words, it set the tone for his future academic and research activities. A book was published, a very remarkable book, on the presidency of the Security Council. And then he had to leave, but he continued his scholarly work in Cambridge, as you know, as we have heard, and also at the University of South Carolina. He divided his time between the two. He was actually a traveling scholar, itinerant. He was doing that, and there was a spate of publications, articles based on his research, based on his experience, and also he spent, I think, 1 year as the president of the World Federation of United Nations Associations, WFUNA, and he used to travel. And he was a fascinating, actually, lecturer. His booming voice, I could still hear. Now, when all this was said and done, when he left UNITA, he was honored by the United Nations. The General Assembly did something which unprecedented, actually. No, I might say, only one was honored that way in the United Nations. I think it was Sadruddin Khan, as head of the refugee agency. I think it was Sadruddin. So the General Assembly adopted unanimously a resolution commending Dr. Nicol. And it was a vote of gratitude, actually, for all the contribution that Dr. Nicol made. Now, this is in the records of the United Nations, and this was in 1981. I end my remarks here. Thank you very much.
Well, no, thank you, Dr. Andy Michael, not just for the way in which you have brought to life Davidson Nicol as an academic, as a diplomat, as a scientist, as a real towering intellect, an activist globally. But thank you also for your own distinguished service as an international civil servant. Thank you very much indeed. You know, Dr. Davidson Nicol described Dr. Nicol as in a way a father figure, and indeed that's the way in which a number of people of a different generation whose life he touched have described him, and amongst those is Kayode Adesimi Robin Coker, an educational consultant, author of Dancing on My Way, who came up to St. John's College in Cambridge in 1983 to read English. And I know that Kayode Robin Coker also saw this remarkable man, Davidson Nicol, as a mentor and a father figure who inspired him to write poetry and to represent really what Dr. Kwame Nkrumah called the African personality. You know, something that is the embodiment, the essence of Africa. And so we're going to invite Kayode to bring him alive as a literary figure, as someone who inspired and wrote poetry. Kayode.
Thank you, Lord Boateng, and good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
The timing of my first meeting with Dr. Davidson Nicol was rather fortuitous. I had recently arrived as a postgrad student at Cambridge. He had recently retired from that incident-filled roller coaster of a professional life at the UN that we've just heard about. And he'd come back to live at his permanent Cambridge residence on Thornton Road. So he was giving a series of lectures on international relations here in Cambridge. And I attended one of those at the Sidgwick site, introduced myself to him afterwards, and I was invited along with my wife to dinner at his home the next evening. And it was the beginning of a relationship I count as easily the most influential on my life, although sadly it came in what turned out to be the final decade of his remarkable life. It was nevertheless an indescribable honor to be somewhere, anywhere, and really in the shadow of this legend, to borrow an appropriate term from my children. This man who so fittingly encapsulated the epithet of best of Sierra Leone. And it is a pleasure to share a few reflections about the man called Davidson Nicol. Thinking back to that lecture series of his I referred to a moment ago, the fascinating aspect of it was his encyclopedic knowledge of the backstory to the significant political events and characters of our time, and his ability to tell that backstory with the assurance and the authority of an eyewitness. Perhaps the most vivid impression I have of Dr. Nicol is of his calm, unruffled demeanor and equanimity that put people at ease with himself. His house was like a reinvented United Nations in the diversity and heterogeneity of the people you were likely to meet there at any one time. He loved entertaining with a small e, and of the relatively cerebral kind. And he loved having people around, especially young people pursuing academic studies locally, some of whom were newly arrived in Cambridge and very much appreciative of the connections facilitated thereby. Dr. Nicol was always solicitous about your welfare, always assuring you that he was there if you wanted to talk about anything. If he invited you to his house, he made time for you. Once, when he was in the middle of regaling a small group of guests with an interesting anecdote, his housekeeper came in, apologizing for interrupting. "It's King Hussein of Jordan on the phone for you, sir." "I will call him back shortly," Dr. Nicol said, and carried on with the story. And that ability to make you feel every bit as valued as any of his numerous celebrity acquaintances was a truly special gift. And my wife addressed him as Dr. Davidson Nicol on our first visit to his home. "Call me Daddy," he said. So Daddy he became to us thereafter. Dr. Nicol, Daddy, had a wry sense of humor, so finely distilled that you would have to sometimes wait on the other side of his jokes for us to catch up. On one occasion, a lady guest told us she'd been visited by an angel while she was praying the night before. "You're not expecting a baby, are you?" Dr. Nicol inquired. No, I don't think so," she replied. "Well, keep praying," he advised her. I recall a sort of fact-finding trip we made to Oxford with his son Sylvester, who was looking to start medical school. Dr. Nicol confessed to not having previously visited Oxford, perhaps just not having thought it at all necessary. And indeed, I was taken along as a sort of tour guide, as I'd previously been at Balliol, Oxford before coming up to Cambridge. We had a nice enough day at Oxford, I thought, but in the end, the other place lost. Perhaps failing to match the allure of Cambridge, not sure, but a couple of weeks after that, Sylvester took up a place to study medicine at Christ's Cambridge, following in the footsteps of his dad and his older brother Charles to become the third Nicol scientist to train there. And I could add that Sylvester has gone on to establish both a successful career as a medic, talking about following in footsteps, and a fitting memorial to his father in the form of the Davidson Nicol Hospital, which he built and runs in Freetown, Sierra Leone. As my time is limited, I will in turn limit my contribution to just one more reflective comment relating to one of Dr. Nicol's many careers which are under the spotlight tonight, and that is his accomplished cameo role as a creative writer, which included winning prestigious literary awards such as the 1952 Margaret Rung Prize and Medal for Literature in Africa. He wrote a number of pithy, evocative poems and short stories under the pseudonym of Abiose Nicol. Abiose, by the way, is a Nigerian Yoruba name, usually given to a child born on a Sunday. And so a very appropriate choice by Davidson Nicol, who was born on Sunday, 14th September, 1924. So I will end my reflections by reading a couple of extracts from his widely acclaimed poem, The Meaning of Africa, which has been frequently cited as a poem which, among other things, evokes sentimental vistas of rural, idyllic Africa, and which also speaks volumes about Dr. Nicol's love for the continent. It is a poem that provided me with both perspective and inspiration in my own poetic journey, and indeed furnished both the title and epigraph of my collection, Dancing on My Way. It reads, Africa, you were once just a name to me, but now you lie before me with somber green challenge to that loud faith for freedom, life more abundant, which we once professed, shouting into the silent listening microphone, or on an alien platform to a sea of white perplexed faces, troubled with secret imperial guilt, shouting of you with a vision euphemistic, as you always appear to your lonely sons on distant shores. So I came back sailing down the Guinea coast, loving the sophistication of your brave new cities, Dakar, Accra, Cotonou, Lagos, Bathurst, and Bissau, Liberia, Freetown, Libreville. Freedom is really in the mind. Go up country, so they said, to see the real Africa. For whomsoever you may be, that is where you come from. Go for bush, inside the bush. You will find your hidden heart, your mute ancestral spirit. So I went, dancing on my way. From south and east, and from the west, the sandy desert holds the north. We look across a vast continent and blindly call it ours. You are not a country, Africa. You are a concept, fashioned in our minds each to hide our separate fears, to dream our separate dreams. Only those within you who know their circumscribed plot and till it well with steady plow can from that harvest then look up to the vast blue inside of the enameled bowl of sky which covers you and say, this is my Africa, meaning I am content and happy. I am fulfilled within, without, and roundabout. I have gained the little longings of my hands, my loins, my heart, and the soul that follows in my shadow. I know now that is what you are, Africa. Happiness, contentment, and fulfillment, and a small bird singing on a mango tree. Thank you very much for listening to me. Over to you, Lord Boateng.
A small bird singing on a mango tree. Coda, you have conjured up our beloved continent. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Oga. Oga. Good. Well, we're going to go back to the family now. And I don't know whether we've managed to make contact with Aina. I know she's been trying to get into this call, but we live in this COVID world of webinars and Zoom and all the rest, and it's sometimes difficult to make the connection. Is Anima with us?
Sadly, I'm afraid she's not. So I think what we will do is we will, yeah, but we will make contact with her after this event, and we will hopefully be able to record with her separately and to add that to the recording that goes on the website.
I think, thank you very much for that, Alan. That's a very inventive way of ensuring that her voice is heard. But you know, we're lucky. We've got Zachary, the newest, youngest generation of Nichols with us. Like his grandfather, an artist, a performer, based in Chicago. Now, you're too young to have known your granddad, but he's clearly impacted you, and not just genetically. So tell us something about the way you relate to his memory and what he means to you, Zach.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lord Boateng, and thank you to Churchill Archives and all the organizers of this event. And all the speakers. It's been wonderful to hear such personal stories and recollections, and the way that he has touched so many lives. So thank you. So I have not met Davidson Nicol, but my own construction of my grandfather and his life have been largely based on an amalgam of just personal recollections, anecdotes from family, hearing the broad strokes of his biography, and my attempts to read in between the lines of his writing across genre to assemble something of his personality and his politics. It was easy, especially as a child, to idealize a man whose achievements preceded him and whose professional contributions continue to be recognized. As I begin to consider my grandfather's legacy once more as an adult, it was a personal wonder for me to encounter an interview of his in a collection of interviews with prominent African scientists conducted by Lee Nichols, no relation, and transcribed from a broadcast of the program Voice of America in 1980. So this interview was actually the first time that I could take in my grandfather's voice outside of the relative formality of his writing and hear his recollections of his time at Cambridge and as a young man in England and how he considered his legacy on younger generations. So I've heard more than once that he was renowned for his delivery of his stories. And so in this slide, I just wanted to share some excerpts of this interview so we can hear his own words.
Oh, great, good.
So I'll just start with some recollections of his early days. So Dr. Nicol recalled his early school days, quote, "We planted beans in a jam jar with a wet blotting paper around it inside and watched them sprouting. I was told by my mother that at the age of 5 and 6, I used to bring some of the beans home to help my parents start a farm. We were taught maths at infant school by counting beans. My interest in science and biology thus started very early indeed." End quote. And to continue, so upon obtaining a BA degree at Cambridge with first-class honors, in natural sciences, he had planned to do his medical internship at the London Hospital Medical College. At that point, an event occurred which he said helped to shape his future career. Quote, "It's an ill will which blows no one any good, as I did an instructorship in physiology which helped to shape my career because of an incident of racial prejudice which I cannot forget. I was put up for an internship in cardiology, and from my name and from my record, I was selected. But we all had to parade to be seen by the consultants, our future chiefs. When the consultant in cardiology saw me, he had accepted me as I had an English name and a good degree. He recognized me as Black and said he would not have me. I learned later from those who sat on the examining board that there was some dismay. The liberal ones on the British panel protested, but the cardiologist was adamant, and then at last one said, 'I will take him as an instructor in physiology until we can find a place for him.' I balanced that racial incident with the kindness of the other white staff who had faith in me. After the instructorship in physiology under a wonderful professor, I went on to work as an intern with a professor of medicine who was very neutral and reserved. I do not think he liked me particularly, but he took me on as a point of principle. Later, we became great friends, and I ended up by getting the best internship in the hospital by the time I had finished." Equally important to his scientific accomplishments, Dr. Nicol believes was his part in helping to break the stereotyped view that Africans were intellectually inferior human beings and that they could not do advanced science. He recalled his early days at Cambridge in the 1940s, quote, "Non-white students, Africans, Asians, and West Indians, were said to be able to do well in exams in art subjects or law or mathematics, where they could repeat answers like parrots. But in science, some felt we had some genetic defect in our brains, which could not allow us to do well in scientific subjects or do research. Well, at Cambridge more than 30 years ago, thanks to the preparation of my African science teachers at home and the encouragement of my British teachers, I was one of those who broke through the sound barrier with high honors in science, a doctorate in research, and a college fellowship. It is important to me because since then, others have done so and have done better. I can remember, for example, a Ghanaian chemist who became a fellow of Churchill College, a botanist from Malawi who became a fellow of Magdalen College, a Nigerian hematologist who became a fellow of King's College, Cambridge. I've met 2 or 3 recently who have told me that during their studies, when things were rough with them as students, they had told themselves that if Davidson Nicol could do it, then certainly I can do it too. To have been a small role model and to have broken through for Black students, what was at that time said to be impossible, was something that gives me great satisfaction. I remember so distinctly at that time when my final results came through that my tutor rang up a journalist to tell him that we had an African here who had obtained the best first-class honors in natural sciences in the college. The first question the journalist asked was, "Has he got any white blood in him?" And my tutor said, "Well, I have not asked him, but as far as I can see, he's completely Black." Dr. Nicol said science in general is making headway in Africa, but to make major advances, he felt the educational system needs to be revised. Good students, good scientists do not begin at the university, they begin at school. We need better school laboratories as well as good laboratories for girls' schools too. Boys and girls should be taught science. It should start at the elementary level, it should go on to the secondary level, and then it should be done at the university level. And finally, on his legacy. From the point of view of human knowledge, as I said earlier, all I can hope to have left behind are footnotes. The other day, my son and I, one of my sons who was a medical student and is now qualified, went to buy a textbook. While looking through it, he saw a reference saying Nicol D and Smith LF, the structure of human insulin, which pleased us, and I must pay tribute to my collaborator and great friend, an Englishman of the best type called Leslie Smith. We worked together for part of the time at Cambridge. In the past year or two while traveling, I've met distinguished professors and scientists who were my students, both at Cambridge, at London University, at Ibadan, and at Forabe College. This pleased me, as I could see that they were all better men and women than I was. And this is what progress means.
Thank you very much indeed, Zachary, for the choice of the words. They reveal a lot, not least in the way in which they call out racism, as racism has to be called out. But also, Zachary, I say this to you, and I say it also, I think, to Charles. I mean, we don't on this webinar hear Davidson Nicol, but we do get a sense of that voice of which everyone talks, I think, for both of you. It's very special.
Indeed.
And, you know, of course, I mean, I've never, Charles, we've never seen each other before. I've not seen you before, but I have heard you. And so I remember the voice. and I won't forget your voice either, Zachary. Thank you. And you've brought Davidson Nicol's voice alive, I think, both of you. Now we've got an opportunity for the next 10, 15 minutes, if we're all very disciplined, for questions from those people who we've been able to have join us. Although, of course, this webinar will be recorded, thanks to Alan and his team, and it will be posted online. But we've got, 80 plus people who've joined us for this event. So a big thank you to them, and we're looking forward to their questions. Alan.
Okay, well, first of all, just a reminder to our audience that you can submit your questions and comments using the Zoom Q&A function. I have one comment that came in really very, very quickly, almost as soon as our event had started, from Yvette Stevens, which I'll read out, and I think it echoes what so much of what's been said. And she writes, "I am a proud Sierra Leone who benefited from the mentorship of Dr. Davidson Nicol," that word mentorship again, one of the greatest Sierra Leoneans who lived. Thanks for showcasing his life and work. So, I mean, do bring in those comments. If I can turn to sort of a first question, and that's really to ask about how Davidson Nicol has been commemorated. We've heard reference made to the fact that he was the model for a statue of Jesus Christ, but we've also heard mention of the Davidson Nicol Hospital. But the question is, how else has he been commemorated? Where is he commemorated, and how? And if there isn't sufficient commemoration, what form should it take?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a question that we might ask in Cambridge after this webinar, because Cambridge, Oxford, Bristol, London, we're all looking for other images, other statues, other portraits. I can't help reflect on the fact that if you go to All Souls, in Oxford, you see a portrait of Willie Abraham. So maybe we should have a portrait or some evocation in Cambridge of Davidson Nicol. But can any of the panel help us on Charles, has he been memorialized in a statue or in a portrait or in any other way? You're muted.
There we go.
Yeah, okay.
One of the halls of residence at Forbay College it was named after him, Davidson Nicol Hall. In fact, in one of his mischievous moods, he went up there. He was telling me, and wandering around the college, and asked one of the students who were going in there, who was this Davidson Nicol? He was wont to do that sort of thing. I mean, he had a very quixotic side.
Yes.
He told me that the student said, well, this is an academic Creole man from about 100 years ago.
Coyote, what about, and Dr. Andy Michael, have the UN done anything to commemorate him at UN headquarters?
Mute.
Burhan, you're on mute.
Not that I know of, but I mentioned that in 1982, when he was leaving the General Assembly, that's the way the UN does it.
Yeah.
He was the second man, actually, second person to be honored that way. And I don't know whether they honored others. And the resolution of commendation was done during the 37th session of the General Assembly, and its resolution 141 of 1982. So this is actually the highest
honor
recognition they could give. They don't do monuments unless those monuments are given as a gift to the United Nations.
Yes.
Chief Buthuli, for example, of South Africa, has a sculpture, but this was donated. That's how it's done.
I wonder if, we might try and get hold of a copy of the resolution and frame it and put it up in the Archive Center. That itself would be a good way of memorializing this remarkable man.
Part of the archives, but I was willing to send a copy of the text and also a framed sort of ceremony that was used when he left at his farewell party. The ambassador of Sierra Leone actually handed him that framed resolution. I have a picture of that, so I can send both the text itself and also the framed photograph.
Both, and that's very, very kind of you, and we can make sure that it is hung somewhere prominent.
Thank you.
have we got any more questions?
We do. They're starting to come thick and fast. So I'll move to a comment. So this is from Leomede Thomas, and who writes, Uncle Davidson and Auntie Marjorie were good family friends, and I recall two fond memories. As a child, my mum and I stayed with them at their apartment near the UN, and when I was much older, we visited them in Cambridge, and I went punting in the river for my one and only time, though can't recall him going in. I wish I knew his achievements then, especially with insulin, as we would have had a great conversation since I read chemistry. It's so important to promote his achievements, so I featured him as a notable Creo in an exhibition I curated at the Museum of London Docklands. Diabetes UK do not appear to tell his insulin story, so I told it for World Diabetes Day on the 14th of November, and she's included a link. We also have two questions that have come in. From Patricia Davis, where did Davidson Nicol get his moral grounding? Was he a religious man?
That's a very interesting question. Charles.
Yes. Davidson Nicol was a Creole. In Sierra Leone, that had a particular meaning in terms of historical significance. The Creoles were the descendants, if you like, of the slaves and the recaptives, people who didn't actually make it across the Atlantic, but were turned back by the British Navy into Freetown, hence the name. This society was therefore slightly more anglicized than the others, and had very Victorian senses of moral rectitude and Christianity. He was a very staunch Creole. I believe he played the organ when he was young. He came from quite a church loving family, and I think a lot of it came from that. There was a streak in him, though, that was not agnostic, not atheistic, but philosophical. Mm. He didn't, as it were, swallow totally any one religion. In fact, in his last days, he was busily perusing the Quran, I guess covering all of the bases. This was in his last few months. And we had several interesting conversations about that as well. So I would say that he was a humanist. He was very, very kind, very concerned with the well-being of his wider family and students, young people in general. But I don't think you could say his religious convictions came from any strict Christianity.
Thank you. Another question, Alan.
Okay, so this comes from a Churchill College student from Aussie. And he asks, I'm curious to know from the panel how far we've come from Davidson Nicol's time in terms of progress in the sciences for Black researchers. Side note, we currently don't have any Black Nobel Prize winners in STEM.
Very good question. Yeah, Tendai.
Yeah, so I mean, since Davidson Nicol was alive, we've definitely made great progress in the sciences. There have been a lot more efforts, especially to increase the pipeline of students. So especially in the US, there's lots of programs where they offer scientific research experiences for underrepresented students. And so that also increases the pipeline of scientists who go on into the higher education. So we've definitely made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done, that's for sure.
There is a lot of work to be done. And I think it's worth remembering that at the time that Davidson Nicol was a vice chancellor, and then when he was setting up UNITA, there was this very great sense amongst Pan-Africanists, and Kwame Nkrumah embodied this, of the importance of STEM in Africa as a pathway to development. And that's why you saw established in Ghana, in Kumasi, in 1962, 63, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, because that generation of African leadership, which Davidson Nicol, my father, Kwame Nkrumah, and others represent, saw the political emancipation of Africa as only meaningful if it was followed by the economic and scientific emancipation. And the sad fact is that that generation saw and brought about the political emancipation, but the economic and the scientific still is a work in progress. And that's why memorializing and remembering are being inspired by the likes of Davidson Nicol, and also generation that Tendai represents taking up the flame. That's why it's so important that happens. And I think this evening's event has contributed to that. We can have, I think, one last, Coyote.
Okay. So
we've got to begin to draw it to a close.
Can I quickly?
Coyote, you were saying something.
Yeah, can I quickly interject there on that point of us not having a STEM winner of the Nobel Prize? I would say if there's any justice in this world, Davidson Nicol should have been a co-winner of the Nobel Prize in 1958, because his groundbreaking work on the breakdown of insulin in the human body was every bit as important as the work being done on insulin by Professor Sanger, who won the prize. But I've been reminded by somebody that students don't win Nobel Prizes, so I guess that's where.
Thank you for that, Coyote. We've got time perhaps for one more question, Alan.
Okay, so one comment picking up on what Coyote has just said. Students may not win Nobel Prizes, but the Students' Politics Society at Christ's is named the Davidson Nicol Society. That's from Jane Stapleton. And then perhaps then for the last question, this is from Ian, who asks, what would Davidson Nicol have said to African leaders in particular today?
Good question, very good question. And I'm going to go to, Bertha, you give us, I'm going to go to everyone for that, because I think it's such an important question. Everybody must give their answer. So we'll begin with you, Bertha. What would Davidson Nicol say to African leaders today? Unmute yourself, Bertha. You're for it, or you're thinking. Well, while you're thinking about it, we're going to go to Charles.
I think he would have emphasized the STEM. I think he was extraordinarily documented in terms of documenting his work. I must admit it was a supreme surprise to find out that you had 206 cases of his documents. The family didn't imagine it was that large. I think that he would encourage Pan-Africanism. He would encourage the United Nations principles. He would be very much against the sort of divisive politics of today. But yes, it's a very hard question, but I mean, I think he would follow the UN line on development as opposed to tying oneself to any one set of politics, and get leaders in Africa, leaders in the world who genuinely are interested in development and who are strong enough to resist the almost incredible pressures that are put on any African leader today.
Thank you for that, Charles. Coyote.
He'd probably have advocated investing in the young because they are the future. He was always banging on about the relatively reduced opportunities for young people in our day compared to his. And I probably might also say to African leaders, work with rather than against each other, because he had an endless mine of stories of ways in which African leaders could have actually flexed their muscles, exercised more strength, more authority on the world stage, if only they worked more collaboratively.
Thank you. Berthan, what would Davidson Nicol say to African leaders today?
Is it me?
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think he'd say to African leaders today, Davidson?
In general, I think he would be disappointed and frustrated at the lack of progress. I say this because when he was head of UNITAR, when I worked with him, Secretary General Waldheim sent him on a mission, one of the few missions. Actually, he should have been given more mission in connection with peace and the humanitarian problems. He was sent to Ethiopia. The military government, the Derg, took power. And not only did they kill about 60 officials, high officials, but they imprisoned members of the royal family. And some members of the royal family, there were two young ladies who were, I think, graduates of Cambridge University, grandchildren of the emperor. Anyway, graduates of a British university. And they were among those put under house arrest. Eventually, their grandfather, the emperor, was killed, but he was still alive then in prison. And Dr. Nicol was sent to Ethiopia.
And what did he say? This is what we want to hear. What was his message? What would his message be to African leaders today? Just in a sentence.
His message would be, I'll be blunt,
Yes.
Wise up to the leaders.
Wise
Make
up.
peace, avoid conflict, and take care of the humanitarian issues, imprisonments of whatever goes on. Stop this nonsense, you would say.
That is a message. Thank you for that,
message.
Berthan, because that's a message that all sides in Ethiopia need to hear today. Now I'm going to go to the younger generation to lead us out on this. We must have their voice. Tendai, to you first. What would Davidson Nicol say to African leaders today, do you think?
So I'll mirror what Charles said. And I do believe that he would motivate them to invest a lot more within biotechnology and scientific research, because that's just really not a huge priority for African leadership at the moment. And the reason why this is important is because the African genome has so many variations and a lot of information that just hasn't been tapped into. And that will be important also for developing better therapeutics. And I'll just give an example in terms of diabetes. So diabetes is greatly increasing due to the increase of urbanization within Africa. And so the issue is that a lot of the medications which are given to diabetic patients in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa are those which are used in the West, but the etiology and the mechanisms of diabetes are slightly different genetically in people from sub-Saharan Africa, but you're still giving them the same exact medications. And so we definitely need to increase the amount of clinical research specifically for people in Africa.
Thank you. Zachary.
Yes, I think I must turn to his word, the man himself. In this interview, he actually says, from the angle of human development, I feel that our advancement toward being modern nations depends a great deal on how we educate our young in science and technology. We're living in an age when the computer is important, where the transistor is important, and where satellite communications are important. We shall get left behind, and we are being left behind if people keep telling us, oh, you are at the village level, you should use 2 sticks to rub together to get fire, or you should wait for some time with applied and intermediate technology whilst development goes steadily and rapidly on in the developed world. So yes, I think he definitely would emphasize development, the young, teaching the young the young science and technology. And also probably he would emphasize interdisciplinarity. And, you know, this was a man who was working on so many registers across genres, across fields. And I think that is really something that we as young thinkers, young scholars can take on in his legacy, is thinking across registers, across disciplines, being maybe more undisciplined in our own thinking and unruly.
Unruly.
I agree.
Mixing it up, bringing those different disciplines together, but bringing them together with passion and excellence. And I think we've got that sense from all our contributors today. You have evoked the memory of this remarkable man, Davidson Nicol, with passion and with excellence. This event has done him proud. We owe him. And we must not forget him. We mustn't forget him as a Pan-Africanist. We mustn't forget him as an educator. Davidson Nicol sent his son, Charles, to a school at Chimota, same school as my dad sent me a couple of years earlier. And it was founded by three remarkable men. Governor Guggisberg, a colonial administrator, Dr. Fraser, a colonial educator, both of them remarkable, enlightened men, and a third man, Dr. Aggrey, Kwagia Aggrey of Africa. And Aggrey said something which for me rings as true today as it was when he said it. He said of Africa, its needs, its future, only the best is good enough for Africa. Only the best is good enough for Africa. Well, Davidson Nicol was one of the best. And the message to African leaders, the message to us all, is that we need to give of our best to Africa, because only the best is good enough. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for this event. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for the whole team at the Churchill Archive Center. It's been a great event in memory of a truly great man, Davidson Nicol.